Emma Brooker had never thought a single lie could change the rhythm of her entire existence. Yet here she was, standing in the grand ballroom of the Century Plaza Hotel, surrounded by chandeliers that glittered like frozen constellations, her pulse racing in a way no board presentation had ever managed to provoke. The laughter of executives and their elegant spouses echoed off marble walls, mingling with the mellow notes of a string quartet. Every sound pressed upon her nerves, every glance felt like scrutiny, and every whisper seemed to hold her name. Her navy dress was perfect, her makeup soft and precise, but no shade of lipstick could hide the panic trembling beneath her smile. She had told them she was married. Not simply married, but married to the one man she could hardly bear to sit across from in a meeting without clenching her fists under the table. She had called Ryan Chambers her husband. The coldest, most impossible man in the company. And the strangest part was that the moment his arm had wrapped around her waist, steady and unshakable, she had felt a sliver of comfort she hadn't expected. Like his touch had healed some invisible crack she didn't know had widened inside her over the years of being alone. Emma had not planned on deception. Her heart was too soft for games, too earnest for tricks. She wanted to be seen, to be accepted, to be loved as she was, messy, hopeful, flawed, creative. But when Patricia Blackwood had asked that simple, merciless question, "So, darling, when will we meet your husband?" Emma's lungs had locked, and her voice, desperate for survival, had betrayed her. Out had slipped the name of the man who had dismissed her campaigns with surgical precision, the man whose approval she had chased like sunlight in a winter city. Now, as she crossed the ballroom, weaving through clusters of polished laughter and clinking glasses, she saw him, tall, austere, his dark hair gleaming under the chandelier light, his glasses framing eyes sharp as emerald fire. Ryan Chambers, the man she had just married with a single sentence. Her heels clicked against marble as she approached him, and the sound felt like a countdown. Every step pulled her deeper into a story she had not written, a play she did not rehearse, a marriage made of panic but laced with something more, a possibility she dared not name. "Ryan," she whispered when she reached him, her throat dry, her heart like thunder in a fragile cage. He turned, deliberate and steady, his gaze sweeping over her as though she were a quarterly report with unexpected numbers. "Emma, what is the matter?" His voice was calm, measured, and impossibly grounding. "It's somewhat personal," she said, forcing a smile for the other executives nearby. "Married couple business. You know how it is." They chuckled and drifted away, leaving the two of them standing near the tall windows overlooking the glowing city skyline. The air between them felt charged, alive with both tension and an unspoken tenderness she had never associated with him. "I may have done something complicated," she confessed, her voice trembling yet laced with a strange sweetness. "Actually, extremely complicated. Catastrophically complicated." Ryan crossed his arms, the motion elegant, the light catching on the silver of his watch. "Emma, you have 30 seconds before I conclude that this is an inefficient use of my time." She inhaled deeply, her courage barely stitched together. "I told Patricia and the others that you're my husband." The words hung there, raw, impossible, healing and breaking her all at once. For the first time since she'd known him, Ryan did not look annoyed or cold. His expression softened into something she couldn't quite read. It wasn't shock nor disapproval. It was fascination, as if he'd stumbled upon an equation he hadn't expected to solve. "Fascinating," he said finally. And something in his voice, a faint curiosity, a subtle warmth, soothed Emma's fraying nerves. For the first time that night, she felt less like a woman drowning in judgment and more like someone who might, just might, be safe beside him. Patricia's voice cut through the moment like a blade wrapped in silk. "There you two are. We were just saying what a surprise it is, discovering you've been married all along." Emma turned, her panic returning. But then she felt it, the firm weight of Ryan's arm slipping around her waist, pulling her into his side as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The heat of his touch melted into her, a steadying balm. She wanted to resist, to remind herself this was pretend, but instead her body leaned toward his warmth, hungry for something she had denied herself for too long. "When you encounter the right person," Ryan said smoothly, his voice low and resonant, "public displays become unnecessary." Emma nearly gasped at how convincing he sounded. To the others, it was a performance. To her, it felt like a truth she had been aching to hear. His hand at her waist, his presence at her side. It was enough to make the loneliness of 31 years dissolve, just for a moment. Healing, comforting, terrifying. She forced her lips into a smile, yet her heart whispered something entirely different. Could this lie, absurd and reckless, become the doorway to something real? Patricia's entourage clustered around them like jeweled constellations, all polite smiles and bright curiosity. Emma felt the air thicken with expectation, the way weather grows heavy before a summer rain. Ryan's palm warmed at her waist, a quiet anchor, steady as a heartbeat, and some deep, unguarded part of her let out a long, trembling breath. She didn't step away. She didn't even want to. For the first time that night, the noise dulled, and the glassy shine of the ballroom softened around the edges, as if the world had been dipped in warm light. "How long?" one woman asked, her sapphire pendant catching a starburst from the chandelier. 2 years, Ryan answered with impossible ease, and when he looked down at Emma, there was a glimmer of something like playfulness in his eyes. "We prefer discretion." Discretion. The word slid through Emma like a ribbon. She gave a practiced smile, but inside her chest something loosened, an ache she'd carried so long she'd mistaken it for part of her ribs. She felt oddly soothed by the way his fingers settled, not possessive but protective, like he had decided for this one evening to hold up the sky with her. Patricia clapped her hands gently. "Then come. You must sit with us. We've waited long enough to meet the mystery." The head table was a white gold landscape of porcelain plates, crystal stems, and the low twinkle of 100 tiny lights woven through a chain of white roses. Emma sat beside Ryan. The string quartet drifted into a softer sonata, and a waiter set down a bowl of veloute whose silk surface reflected a dim garden of flames. "So," Patricia began, eyes smiling above the rim of her flute, "tell us something we don't know. Who proposed?" Emma's pulse jolted. She could feel Ryan glance at her. She could feel herself glance at him. It might have been panic, but it felt almost like a secret shared between two people who had survived a shipwreck and washed ashore the same island. "Emma did," Ryan said, and the entire table brightened with delight. "I did," she echoed. "In a sense," he went on calmly, voice low enough to be intimate, strong enough to sound true. She proposed a life, one designed for partnership rather than performance. I accepted. A few small sighs circled the table. Someone squeezed Emma's forearm. It was such a gentle lie, fragrant with the shape of truth, that a strange calm poured through her, like warm tea after a long rain. She found her footing in it, found a version of herself that could move without trembling. Yes, she said, the word tasting like courage. We'd both had enough of rooms like this, she added, smiling at the chandeliers. Enough of being looked at and not seen. We wanted the quiet kind of joy, the kind you can feel when a kettle sings in the morning, or when the city finally goes to sleep. Ryan's mouth tilted, barely there, as if the corners of his restraint had softened. We are very fond of kettles, he murmured, and the table laughed. Courses arrived like pearls on a string. Conversation surged and eddied. A woman in ivory asked what kind of wedding they had, and Emma said something about a small ceremony, about light rain and lemon cake in a friend's garden. As she heard herself invent details with effortless grace, 7 paper lanterns, a violinist who only knew how to play 3 songs, but made each sound like a blessing, the way the world smelled of basil and late roses when they said their vows. While she spoke, Ryan's gaze stayed on her, not heavy, not assessing, present. It steadied her, a gentle hand on a frightened bird. "And your first fight?" another woman asked, delighted. "All happy couples have one." Emma's throat tightened, but she made herself breathe. Ryan set down his fork and, so subtle only she could feel it, touched the back of her hand with his little finger, the smallest contact. A promise disguised as nothing at all. Warmth moved up her arm like a tide. "We argued about fonts," Emma said, and the table erupted. "Fonts," Ryan confirmed gravely, which made them laugh harder. "Serif versus sans." Ideology masquerading as typography. "Let the minutes reflect," Emma added, "that I was right." "No minutes exist," he countered, "because the person responsible for writing them used the wrong typeface." It was ridiculous. It was tender. It was healing. The laughter curled around them like steam, and in the pause that followed, she realized the awful certainty that had stalked her all evening had receded. No one saw through them. Or perhaps what they saw was not deception at all, but the bright mirage of 2 people finding shelter in each other's presence. Dessert was a dark square of chocolate that broke under the spoon with a sound like quiet thunder. Emma took a bite and felt sweetness bloom on her tongue. Patricia leaned in, satisfied. "You're truly well matched," she said. "I always thought Ryan needed someone who could unknot his mind but keep his excellence intact." "Do I have knots?" he asked politely. "Radiant, complicated ones," Patricia replied, patting his sleeve. There was a hum in the room that reminded Emma of summers at the lake when she was a child, when cicadas sang and the evening air smelled like grass. She had carried that sound for years, like a protective charm. Tonight the hum felt like it lived in Ryan's silence, the careful intervals between his words, the way he waited for her to speak as if her sentences mattered. Later, when plates were cleared and conversations drifted, Emma and Ryan stood by the tall windows looking out at a city that glittered like a scattered necklace. The glass held their ghost reflections, the lights dressed them in secret constellations. "You were kind," Emma said. "Back there. Thank you." He didn't look away from the night. "You were brave," he said after a moment. "We seem to bring out unusual traits in each other. I didn't know you could be charming." His mouth quirked. "That makes two of us." They were quiet for a breath or two. She could feel how near he was, how the air cooled at the window and warmed around his body. There was a sense of safety she didn't understand, like standing in a doorway on a rainy day and watching the street silver itself, knowing you do not have to go out there yet, not until you're ready. "I suppose we should practice," she said softly. "If we're going to be convincing." "Practice?" He finally looked at her. The chandelier painted a fine gold seam across the lens of his glasses. "Endearments," she said, half teasing, half pleading with something she didn't dare name. "I should be able to call you something that doesn't sound like a cough drop." "I see." He considered this with his usual gravity. "You may select the form of address." "Something simple," she swallowed. "Something warm." "Emma," he said, and her name in his voice was already a balm. "Emma," he tried again, softer. "You look—" He paused, as if searching for a word that wouldn't bruise either of them. "Whole." The compliment slipped past her defenses. Not beautiful, not stunning, though he could have said those, and she would have tried to accept them. Whole. As if he had noticed the places she had been mending, as if he believed the gold in the cracks was not a flaw, but a pattern. Emma's eyes burned. She looked down and smoothed her dress with unsteady hands. "Your turn," he said gently. "What should I call you?" "Whatever makes this easier." She closed her eyes, reached past fear, and said quietly, "Home." He did not move for a long time. Then the slightest breath left him. "That is ambitious," he murmured. "I don't mean forever," she said quickly, heat rising to her cheeks. "Just tonight, so I don't shake apart." He nodded, and something in his posture, some small tension she had not recognized as tension, unwound. "Very well," he said. "For tonight." The quartet's music thinned to a sugar thread. Somewhere a tray chimed and a door sighed. The city's lights winked at them with patient, watchful eyes. Emma felt the street of her life tilt a fraction of a degree, not enough to spill anything, just enough that the water in her glass remembered the moon. They left early. The night air kissed her bare arms, cool and restorative. He offered his coat. She refused, then accepted when a breeze lifted like a question. The wool was warm and faintly scented with bergamot and cedar and the quiet arithmetic of him. They walked to the curb without speaking, as if language might startle away the delicate animal that had wandered between them. He called a car. While they waited, a bus sighed past, full of faces lit by phones, and a pair of teenagers spilled laughter onto the sidewalk. Overhead, the moon was the color of milk. "I realize," Ryan said, "that what we are doing creates a web we will have to untangle carefully. That's a very kind way of saying I turned our lives into origami." "Origami can be unfolded," he said. "The paper remembers, but it can be smoothed." "Does it?" she asked. He glanced at her. "With patience." The car arrived like a relief. In the quiet back seat, city light rolled over their knees. She let her head rest back and watched the world glide by in gentle blurs. Storefronts, a bakery sleeping under powdered sugar, a dog walker in a yellow raincoat, though the night was dry, a woman closing a flower shop and rescuing the last of the peonies from the cold. Everything looked softer, as if the edges had agreed to be kind. "Thank you for not scolding me," she said. "I considered it," he admitted, "but I remembered how it felt when you said you didn't want to be looked at anymore, only seen." He had been listening. It should not have astonished her, but it did. "Does anyone see you?" she asked. He watched a traffic light change color on the ceiling of the car. "Not often. That is partly by design, partly an accident." She wanted to say, "I see you now," but she bit the words back, afraid of their weight. They stopped outside her building. He stepped out, then offered his hand to help her. This was not necessary. The curb was kind, the pavement was sure. But she took his hand anyway, and for the brief climb from seat to sidewalk, she felt the steadiness of him, the unshowy way he held firm, the quiet promise that gravity would not win tonight. "I can make it from here," she said, not releasing his hand until she had to. "I know," he said. It sounded like a blessing. The coat still warmed her shoulders. "Consider the disclosure emails," he added, and she almost laughed at the return of his professional self. "HR will want them by Friday." "I'll draft them," she said. "With the correct font." The corner of his mouth conceded a rare smile. A triumph. Silence braided itself between them again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like a hammock in shade. "Good night," she said, hating the way the words carried the ragged edge of reluctance. "Good night, Emma," he said, and he said it like a promise not to make the morning cruel. She watched him go. The night held her gently, and for once she let it. She tilted her face to the moon for 3 slow breaths, then climbed the steps and let herself in, and the quiet of her apartment was not an accusation, but a refuge. She hung his coat on the back of a chair and pressed her nose to the collar. Bergamot, cedar, a day she would not forget. She washed her face, the water warm as a small animal, and sat on the floor instead of the couch, back against the bed and knees pulled close as if the room could cup her in its palms. Everything inside her felt softer, less afraid. She thought of the ridiculous bouquet of lies they had arranged tonight, and how real the water had been that kept them bright. She thought of his little finger touching the back of her hand, the way he'd said whole as if her name. She picked up a notebook. When life scared her into tightness, she wrote until her breath found its way again. She wrote, "Two strangers choose to be kind in the same moment. This is how weather changes." She wrote, "There is a sweetness that is not sugar, a shelter that is not wood." She wrote, "Perhaps what we pretend can lead us home." Her phone buzzed on the floorboards, a message from an unknown number she now knew by heart. "I hope you found quiet when you got home." She stared at the words until they swam, then typed back, "I did. Thank you for the coat." A pause. "Keep it for now. I have others. You looked warmer." She wanted to tell him the coat wasn't the warmth. She wanted to tell him she had felt something ease in her bones when he stood beside her, like years of trying hard had finally been given permission to rest. Instead she wrote, "Good night. Sleep well. You too, Emma." And then, as if he had stood in her living room and seen the exact place she feared the dark most, "You did well tonight." The words touched something deep and quietly aching. She put the phone down like it was made of glass and leaned her head back. She felt oddly repaired, imperfect, yes, but steadier, like a cracked bowl mended with gold. She slept the way one sleeps after the first day at the ocean, not because she is tired, but because her body has relearned the rhythm of a larger tide. Morning came with pale light unravelling through the blinds. The city yawned. The kettle sang. The coat on the chair looked almost like a person listening. She made toast, then didn't eat it. She stood by the window with both palms pressed to the glass and watched a woman below walk her son to school. He hopped over lines only he could see. Emma wanted to learn to hop over invisible lines too. At the office, everything was exactly itself. White desks, blue light, the prickle of filtered air, and yet it all seemed translated into a kinder language. Jessica stopped by with coffee she hadn't asked for and a grin she couldn't decode. "Any rumors I should swat down?" Emma asked lightly. "Only the usual," Jessica said, eyes dancing. "That you're glowier than last week." "Glow is a strong word," Emma said, but the word made her shoulders drop in a pleasant way. Her screen filled with emails, meetings, slides. She slid into the day's work with the familiar relief of structure. At 9:07, a calendar invite flickered onto her screen. Henderson Project, Conference Room B, 9:30, 10 o'clock. The sender, R. Chambers. There was, of course, no Henderson Project. What there was, apparently, was a man who could not very well write, "We need to breathe together for a moment" in a corporate scheduling tool. She gathered her notebook and went. The room was empty when she arrived, full of the blue hush of glass walls and clean tables. She was halfway through counting the lines in the carpet tile when the door clicked and he entered, the contained weather of him altering the room's pressure by 1 degree. "Good morning," he said. "Morning." She wanted to add home, but she let the word rest on her tongue like a promise saved for the right time. "We have a situation," he said, soft as if he didn't want to startle anything fragile, including her. 3 emails, HR, disclosures, a dinner invitation from Mrs. Blackwood. "Another?" She grinned despite herself. "Does the woman sleep?" Evidence is inconclusive. They sat. Not too close, not far. 2 points on a compass, finding a third. "I'll handle the disclosure drafts," she said. Truthful enough to satisfy compliance, vague enough to keep oxygen in the room. "Thank you." "The dinner?" "Saturday." He folded his hands. "There is also a game." "A game?" "Questions for couples." His mouth shifted, sardonic. "I am told it will be fun." "Fun?" She let the syllable sit between them like a cat that hadn't decided whether to stay. "Then we should study." He arched a brow. "Study." "Not with a spreadsheet," she teased. "Maybe with tea." He considered, then nodded as though she had proposed a merger. "Tonight?" She startled at how quickly relief moved through her. "Yes." He tapped the table once. Agreement. 7. 7. They looked at each other and didn't look away. Outside the glass, the office tided past. People, tasks, tiny economies of effort and grace. Inside, the room felt quiet in the way a chapel can feel quiet when no one is praying, but everyone could. "I need to say something," he said. "Okay." "You were right to choose a word like home." He spoke carefully, like a person reading a name from a medal found in a field. "I have spent a very long time in places where excellence mattered more than gentleness. It makes one competent, not necessarily at ease. She let the sentence move through her like warm water. "You deserve ease," she said quietly. "And you deserve to be seen," he answered, as if returning something she had dropped. A tiny, vivid silence, the kind that makes a person want to live a little longer, just to see what happens next. A shadow moved at the glass. Mark from accounting, pausing with eyebrows raised in Roman arches of gossip. Ryan's jaw flicked almost imperceptibly. Emma suppressed a laugh that would have broken the spell. "We should look like we're discussing budgets," she whispered. "Frown at this blank page." He obliged without being asked twice. He was, after all, excellent at frowning at things. But when he looked back up, the sternness had eased, and something like peace had taken its place. "7, he repeated. 7, she agreed, and in the litany of that small agreement she felt the day soften its shoulders. He stood. She stood. They didn't touch and didn't need to. The room released them. At the door he paused. "Emma?" "Yes?" "You did not ruin anything." He waited for her to absorb it. "You made something possible." After he left, she sat alone a moment longer, the words settling around her like a shawl. Possible, the kindest word, the one with doors built into it. She returned to her desk and worked. She wrote the disclosure drafts with care and a quiet, healing attention, choosing phrases that honored truth while giving tenderness a fighting chance. At lunch, she ate half a salad and a cookie she didn't realize she needed until she tasted it. Mid-afternoon, she caught herself smiling at her screen, not because of what it displayed, but because she could feel the shape of 7 o'clock drawing near like a shore. When the day finally folded itself into evening, the city put on its evening jewelry. She tidied her apartment like a person welcoming a season rather than a guest. Fresh towel, the good cups, a candle that smelled like clean paper and quiet orchards. She told herself this was practice. She told herself it didn't matter that her hands were steady for the first time in weeks. She told herself she would not say home out loud. The knock landed softly, 2 beats, like a heart asking. She opened the door. He stood there in a navy sweater and the winter green of his eyes, holding nothing, offering everything he could without knowing the names of any of it. For a moment they simply looked, and that too was healing, being allowed to look without anyone asking for proof. "Tea?" she said. "Yes," he said. And when he came in, the room breathed easier, as if it had been waiting to exhale. They would answer questions. They would study. They would practice endearments and write an origin story kind enough to live in. But before any of that, she poured hot water over leaves, and the kettle sang, and they stood side by side in the quiet, letting the steam rise like a benediction over the small possible country they were learning to share. The steam curled from Emma's teapot in delicate spirals, rising like whispers of something unspoken. She set 2 cups on the coffee table, the porcelain clinking softly, a sound so ordinary it soothed the edges of her nerves. Ryan sat opposite her, posture still composed, though the sweater he wore made him appear less like the polished executive she had always known, and more like a man at ease, a man who might, under different circumstances, have been sitting across from her, not as a colleague, not as a pretense, but as something real. "Sugar?" she asked, holding up the small ceramic bowl. "Please," he said, and the civility of his voice carried a gentleness that startled her. He stirred his tea with slow precision, and for a long moment silence filled the room. Not an awkward silence, but the kind that wrapped itself around them like a quilt, allowing them to breathe, to exist without performance. Emma curled her legs beneath her, watching him. He looked different in this setting. Not the man who dissected her proposals with merciless analysis, but someone who carried stories she had never thought to ask about. His face was softened by the lamplight, and the shadows seemed to guard him rather than expose him. "We should probably start," she said at last, though part of her wanted to sit in that silence forever. Ryan nodded, reaching into his bag. He produced a notebook, not his infamous whiteboard this time, but an actual paper-bound book, and that alone felt like progress. "I thought we might make this less clinical," he said. Emma smiled, relief trickling through her. "Thank you. I was beginning to feel like I'd married a statistics professor." His mouth tilted in that almost smile she was learning to recognize, the one that meant he was amused but unwilling to admit it fully. "Perhaps a kinder profession than director of brand strategy," he said. They began simply, trading questions back and forth. Favorite movie? Favorite book? Emma admitted to loving old romantic comedies, the kind that ended with grand gestures at train stations or airports. Ryan confessed a surprising fondness for classic rock documentaries, the kind where broken bands found their way back to each other after decades apart. "What about colors?" she asked, leaning forward. "Green," he said without hesitation. "The shade of summer leaves after rain, healing, alive. And you?" "Blue," she whispered, glancing at his sweater. "The kind that feels like safety, like water that holds you instead of drowning you." Their eyes met, and something wordless passed between them, something that neither of them dared acknowledge aloud. The questions grew deeper. Dreams. Regrets. Fears. Emma told him about the time she nearly left her career entirely, worn thin by rejection and doubt. Ryan told her about his relentless pursuit of excellence, and how sometimes it felt like a cage more than a gift. "It's exhausting," he admitted, his voice lower than she'd ever heard it. "Always being the one who must not falter. There are days I wonder what it would feel like to be allowed to simply fail." Emma's heart ached at the honesty in his tone. She reached across the table before she could stop herself, her fingers brushing his. "You're allowed," she said softly. "Even if no one else ever gives you that permission, I do." His hand stilled beneath hers, warm and steady. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his palm so that their fingers aligned. The contact was simple, barely more than skin meeting skin, but it sent a current through her, something both calming and electric, healing in a way she hadn't realized she needed. The teacups cooled, forgotten. The city outside hushed into deeper night, and still they sat, trading questions, trading truths, until the notebook lay closed on the table, and all that remained was the fragile honesty between them. At one point, Ryan leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Emma, may I ask you something not on the list?" "Of course." "When you chose me," he began, voice careful, "in that moment of panic, why?" Emma swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She hadn't expected him to ask, and certainly not in that tone, not with that trace of vulnerability beneath the question. She wanted to lie, to say she hadn't thought at all, that it had been random. But the truth pressed insistently against her chest. Because you were the only one who looked solid, she whispered. Everyone else felt like smoke. But you, I knew you wouldn't let me fall apart. Not even if you didn't like me. Ryan's expression softened in a way that stole her breath. I see, he said quietly. Then perhaps the choice wasn't as irrational as I first thought. Emma laughed weakly, more to disguise the way her eyes burned than anything else. Well, I'm glad my subconscious has better judgment than I do. He didn't laugh. He only looked at her, long and steady, and in that gaze she felt something shift. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a door opening. A door she hadn't known was there. When he finally left that night, he paused at her doorway, one hand on the frame. Emma, he said, and when she looked up, his eyes were softer than the city lights spilling in from the street. Tonight was good. Good, she echoed, though the word felt far too small. He inclined his head, then stepped out, the echo of his presence lingering long after the door clicked shut. Emma leaned against the wood, her palms pressed flat, her heart trembling. The apartment felt different now, less empty, less brittle. She moved to the window and looked down at the street, at the place where his car had just disappeared. The night was quiet, the stars faint, but something inside her glowed brighter than any constellation. For the first time in years, she felt not just alive, but whole. And that feeling, fragile as it was, healed something deep within her. The rain began just before dawn, a hush that brushed the city in silver. Emma woke to its music and lay still, listening, as if the sky were pouring out a blessing it had saved for a tender hour. She made tea and stood at the window in an old sweater, palms wrapped around the warm cup, and let the steam soften her thoughts. The night before had left light inside her ribs. She could feel it when she breathed, a low glow that made ordinary things, kettle, mug, slippers on the mat, look quietly holy. Healing, she thought. It felt like healing. At the office, the world resumed its choreography. Footsteps, the murmur of meetings, the hum of screens. And yet, something had shifted. She noticed it in herself first, how her posture softened instead of bracing, how she looked at people and actually saw them, not as instruments of approval or judgment, but as human beings with mornings of their own. She answered emails without apologizing for her ideas. She argued for a campaign with calm confidence, and when Mark from accounting made a quip about domestic bliss sharpening the mind, she only smiled. She did not flinch. At 10:06, Ryan sent a single-line message. Conference room D, 10 minutes, no subject line, no pretext. A tiny rebellion in a world of agendas. She went. Conference room D had a long, oval table and a reluctant ficus in the corner. Rain stitched faint lines across the glass wall. Ryan stood at the far end, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled once, the neatness of him undone by exactly 2 buttons. He looked like precision learning to breathe. "Good morning," he said. "Morning." She put her notebook down, but didn't open it. "Do we have a faux project to discuss?" "A very urgent one," his mouth curved. "There's going to be an anniversary party." She blinked. "Patricia?" "Patricia," he confirmed. "Friday afternoon?" after the all-hands. Emma felt the room tilt the smallest degree. "A party," she repeated, as if testing a foreign word. "For us?" "Yes. In front of everyone we actually work with. People who remember me bringing cupcakes for my 29th birthday in the break room, and you telling HR that paper clips should be standardized." "An excellent policy," he said mildly, then sighed. "There will be cake and speeches. She would like us to share how we met." Emma pressed her fingers to the table's edge, grounding herself. "We have a Chicago conference," she said. "A violinist, lemon cake, 7 lanterns. We have the scaffolding." "We do," he said. "But scaffolding is not a building, and the people in that room have lived beneath our real roof for years. Which means they'll know if the beams are wrong." He nodded, eyes steady on her. "We can fabricate details, or we can tell a different kind of truth." "A different truth," she echoed, feeling something as delicate as a moth beat its wings inside her chest. The kind that doesn't list dates as much as moments. "The kind that risks us," he said softly. Silence stretched like a silk ribbon between them. She could hear the rain's fingers at the window. She could hear her own breathing, and his, a matched rhythm that calmed some frightened animal inside her. "Then let's risk us," she said, because the floor of her life had shifted, and there was no point pretending it hadn't. "But not recklessly, carefully, kindly. Let's choose what we're willing to say in a room full of fluorescent lights." "Agreed," he said. "Kindness will be our policy." They sat side by side, leaving just enough space for the air to feel safe. Together, they built an origin story that wasn't false so much as pruned. He would say he first noticed her when she argued with him in a meeting, and he found himself grateful to be argued with. She would say she first noticed him when he listened harder after she pushed back, which was a rarer thing than talent. He would say he admired her courage. She would say she trusted his steadiness. No fireworks, no cinematic vows, a small, luminous truth held in steady hands. When they finished, Emma looked down and realized she'd written none of it. "I should take notes," she said, and then laughed, a soft, astonished sound. "But I think I know it by heart." "Good," he said, and in the amber of his gaze she caught a reflection of something warm and brave. "Because we're going to need our hearts." He walked her back toward the hallway, and they paused just before the door. Through the glass she could see the river of office life. She could also see their own reflection, a pair aligned not by accident, but by choice. People learning the art of standing close without making promises language could not yet carry. "Emma," he said, voice low, "may I ask for something unusual?" "You've already asked me to fake marry you," she said lightly. "I'm prepared." "One small piece of choreography," he said, not smiling now. "For Friday. If I place my hand here," he touched his chest above the pocket, "it means I'm veering toward panic. If you touch the table with your fingertips, it means you need me to slow down, to breathe, signals no one else would see." She considered this, the intimacy of a private language built for the simple purpose of care. "All right," she said. "And if I say water?" "I fetch you some." "And if you say steady?" "We both remember how to stand." The corner of his mouth moved. "One more thing." "Yes?" "If anyone asks how we survived the first year, I'd like to say, by being gentle where the world was not." She swallowed, because the sentence unlocked a small door in her throat. "That's good," she managed. "It's true," he said. The week collected itself into a soft drum roll. Rain gave way to mild sun, then back to rain. Each evening they carved out a little island of time to study for the party by not studying for it at all. They walked. They cooked together once, pasta and broccoli and lemon and olive oil, an altar of grated cheese, and laughed when the noodles stuck and the smoke alarm scolded them. They tried to explain their fake beginnings to a sympathetic bartender who had no idea he was being folded into a private rehearsal for the truth. They designated a corner booth at a quiet cafe as Switzerland, neutral ground where they weren't employees or spouses, just two people learning a climate. On Wednesday, Emma had a difficult meeting. A senior executive dismissed a campaign of hers with a wave. "Too soft," he said. "We need aggression." The old panic rose like static at the base of her skull. She almost apologized. Instead, she asked questions. She named data. She held her ground with respect. Afterward, she went to a stairwell and let 3 tears walk calmly down her face. She didn't text Ryan. She didn't want to be the person who only arrived with trouble. He found her anyway, as if he'd learned the map of her silence. He didn't ask. He didn't fix. He merely leaned on the opposite rail, a respectful distance away, and said, "We can be soft and incisive. Those are not enemies." "Tell that to the budget," she said, wiping her eyes with a sleeve. "I intend to," he replied. Then, after a beat, "Steady." She smiled, despite herself. Steady. That night, she slept the kind of sleep that repairs the small, torn places, the sleep of a child who trusts the house will remain on its foundations. Thursday, a rumor swept the floor that HR had sent a compliance packet to Ryan with questions no sane Cupid would ask. Cohabitation dates, department boundary guidelines, a list of gifts exchanged in the last 12 months. "Gifts?" Emma said when he told her. "I almost listed whiteboard markers," he said. "Please don't give me those." "I won't," he said, smile warming. "I'll give you something else." "What?" "Patience," he said, as if the word were a real object he could put in her hands. "And presence, and absolute clarity when we are not clear." It was absurd and perfect. She nodded, feeling a small anchor lower inside her. "I'll give you the same." Friday morning arrived, as if the week had been inhaling, and finally exhaled. Emma chose a dress that didn't make a statement. She was done proving worth with the geometry of fabric. She braided her hair back from her face, not because she wanted to be severe, but because she wanted to see. On her way out the door, she paused and touched the coat he'd once draped around her shoulders. She left it on the chair. She didn't need it for warmth anymore. The all hands was a sea of faces under kind lighting and a slideshow of robust metrics. When the final applause faded, Patricia rose from the front row like a conductor about to coax something grand from the orchestra. "Before we dismiss," she announced, voice in its most celebratory register, "we have a joyful surprise for 2 very discreet people." A ripple of laughter. Heads turned. Emma felt the old stage fright reach for her. She placed her fingertips on the table in front of her, the agreed signal, and felt it subside, as if fear recognized it had been spotted and decided to behave. Ryan, at her side, touched his chest once, lightly. She shifted her weight toward him, the slightest tilt, saying without words, "I'm here." "Ryan and Emma," Patricia beamed. 2 years of marriage. You've hidden your happiness so expertly that we feel positively heroic to have unearthed it. She gestured them forward to the front. Someone wheeled out a cake that looked like a snowfield under winter sunlight. They stood together facing the room, and for a heartbeat the scene doubled. She could see the there and now, the faces, the laughter, the camera phones, the cake, and also the small circle around them no one else could see, a radius drawn with ordinary kindness, with patience, with signals, with the humility to admit fear and the courage to ask for help. She breathed once, twice. Then she began. "When I joined the company," she said, "I thought success meant being unbreakable. I wore the sharpest edges I could find. I mistook harshness for strength and silence for privacy. I didn't understand yet that being deeply seen is not a threat, but a shelter." She looked at Ryan, not theatrically, not for effect, just to remember the shape of steady. "Then I met someone who listened in a way that made me brave enough to change my mind." A hush. The kind that happens when people are not only hearing you, but gathering your words into their own pockets. Ryan took his turn without flourish. "When Emma presented her first idea to me," he said, "it startled me how alive it felt. Not just clever, alive. I challenged it because I was afraid of everything that could go wrong. She challenged me back because she trusted everything that could go right." He paused, the barest breath. "I am learning to trust that, too." Laughter stirred gently, not at them, but with them. Someone dabbed at an eye. Someone else put a hand on a colleague's shoulder. Emma felt the air stabilize, as if the room had agreed to be kind. Patricia, beaming, held up a card. "We gathered questions," she announced, wicked with delight. "A game, just a few." Groans, affectionate boos. All right," she laughed. "First, what do you argue about when no one is watching?" "Fonts," they said together, and the room erupted. The tension released like a band snapping toward freedom. "Second," Patricia went on, "what did you misunderstand about each other at the start?" "That we were enemies," Emma said, voice calm, and felt a tremor of truth move through the room like a tuning fork's note. "That excellence and gentleness were mutually exclusive," Ryan added, and if you listened closely, you could hear the soft click of people reconsidering old habits. "Last one," Patricia said, eyes bright. "What is your secret?" Emma looked at him, and for once she didn't worry about how anything looked. She simply told the truth they had made. "We are gentle," she said, "where the world is not." A stillness. Then applause. Not wild, not triumphant, but warm, continuous, like rain on a roof. Someone started a chant for cake. Someone else put on a song from a decade ago. The crowd drifted from chairs to plates, from curiosity to celebration. They stepped back from the spotlight's small circle. No one interrogated them. No one demanded receipts. Emma realized the terror she'd carried all week had overlooked a simple fact. Sometimes people want a reason to be kind, and will take the first one offered. They cut the cake. She icinged his knuckle by accident. He looked at the smudge like it was a riddle, then lifted his hand in a half-question. She laughed and wiped it away with a napkin, and an involuntary cheer went up, as if they had performed a sacrament. She rolled her eyes, but her rib cage was a lantern. She felt lighter than she had any right to feel. Eventually the room loosened into afterglow. people drifted back to their days. Patricia hugged them in a flurry of diamonds and good intentions and whispered, "You gave them something human," and then sailed away toward the dais like a satisfied ship. Ryan and Emma stood near the far window where the light came in kinder. The quiet between them felt like the inside of a seashell, curved, protective, humming with something older than words. "You were brave," he said. "So were you." She looked down at the little paper plate balanced in her hand. "We didn't lie." "No," he agreed. "We didn't." They watched their co-workers return to their lives, carrying a small extra warmth that hadn't been there an hour before. Emma felt an impulse move through her, clear and unfrightened. She set the plate down, turned to him, and said, very softly, so only he could hear, "I don't want to pretend anymore." He didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who had been keeping a light on in a window and was relieved to see it recognized. "All right," he said, just as quietly. "Then let's not." "After today," she added, practical even in wonder, "we'll need boundaries. We'll need to talk to HR properly, find a way to restructure reporting. We'll need to be boringly responsible." "Boring is a fair price," he said. "We can be thrilling in our spare time." She laughed, a sound that felt like the first warm day after too long a winter. "Thrilling," she repeated. "Carefully." "Carefully," he agreed. "Kindly." They didn't kiss. Not there. Not under the friendly glare of ceiling lights and the grin of a cake that had already surrendered 2 corners. Instead, he reached for her hand, not dramatically, not claiming, simply asking. She gave it to him. Their palms met. Something uncoiled. The world did not tilt. It steadied. That evening, when the building had emptied its bright thoughts into the streets, they walked. No destination. Side by side, like 2 people practicing the ancient craft of presence. The rain had rinsed the air clean. The city smelled like pavement and bread, and the shy courage of green things. They spoke of small matters because the big ones had already been spoken. Should they try the new coffee place on 9th? Whether the library's reading room was open late? How her grandmother used to mend cracked bowls with lacquer and gold, not to hide the break, but to honor it. "That," he said, "seems like the right metaphor for us." "Which part?" she asked. "The breaking or the gold?" "Both," he said, "especially the gold." They reached a small park where the lamps were modest and the benches unambitious. They sat. The trees held up their thin hands to a clean sky. Somewhere a violin practiced a few streets away, a line of melody that lifted and faltered and lifted again. They listened, letting the music teach the air how to rest. "Tell me something true," he said, not as a challenge, but as a gift. "I was afraid today," she said, "but I felt you beside me, and the fear did not win." He was quiet for a long moment. "I have spent years building a life that didn't require me to lean. Today I leaned. It did not break me. It healed me." She turned to him then, and in the calm of that small park, with the day softening around them like a sigh, she let her hand learn his face. Not possessive, not dramatic, just a palm pressed to a cheek, a thumb tracing the bracket where worry had lived and might live again, but not tonight. His eyes closed. When he opened them, they were unguarded as a new morning. "Emma," he said, barely more than a breath. "Yes." "Home," he said. She felt the word find its old place in her chest and make it new. She leaned, and he did too. And there, under a modest tree, on a modest bench, after a day that had been both too big and exactly enough, they kissed the way people do who understand that the most radical thing you can offer the world is gentleness. It wasn't a vow, it was a beginning. It was the softest yes. When they parted, the city had grown a shade kinder. They began to walk back, not to his place or hers, but to the corner where choices could be made without drama. They spoke of practicalities, emails to HR, a meeting with the COO, the need to shift her reporting line to another director. They approached it like adults who knew that love was not an exemption from care, but an invitation to practice it daily. At her building, they paused. The door waited with its familiar stubbornness. The night smelled faintly of oranges from the bodega across the street. She looked up at him and felt no urgency to rush or to clutch. She felt time opening its hands. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he echoed. "And the day after that." She touched his collar, then let her fingers rest where a tie might have been if the day had asked for one. "Go home," she said, the word no longer a nickname or a wish, but a blessing. "Sleep. We did something brave." He smiled, slow and unguarded. "We did." She stepped inside. He turned toward the sidewalk. They looked back once, a quiet wave, two people in the soft light of the vestibule and the street, 2 points connected not by panic or performance, but by a choice made in kindness. Upstairs, she set the kettle on as if her hands knew the choreography without being told. The apartment welcomed her like a friend who keeps the good blanket ready. She wrote a few lines in her notebook while the water warmed. Gentleness as architecture. Patience as gift. A language of signals no one else needs to know. When the kettle sang, she poured, and the steam rose like a benediction over the day they had just lived. Down on the sidewalk, Ryan stood for an unnecessary moment, letting the night breeze touch his face. He thought of the first time he had seen her, how he had mistaken fire for recklessness instead of for warmth. He smiled at the correction. Then he walked home beneath a sky that had decided, for once, to be clear, and though the city's noise continued, it did not intrude. It sounded like surf. It sounded like breath. They slept that night on opposite sides of a city stitched together by bridges and traffic lights and the shared courage of 7 letters, steady. In their separate rooms, they dreamed not of parties or speeches, not of scrutiny or compliance packets, but of small kitchens and singing kettles and the unremarkable miracle of sitting quietly with someone who does not ask you to be more than you are, who simply makes it easier to become what you have been trying to be all along. Morning would come. Emails would arrive. HR would reply with polite bullets and attached PDFs. They would answer. They would meet. They would plan the practical choreography required to turn something tender into something durable. They would fail a little and forgive. They would mend with gold, not to hide the seam, but to honor the truth that love does not erase our lines. It traces them gently until the shape of us glows. For now, the city rested. And so did they. Understood. I'll now craft Doan 5. No heading, English only, romantic novel-style narration with a healing undertone, about 3,000 words. I'll also add a natural call at the end, inviting the audience to like, subscribe, and comment, phrased gently so it feels warm and heartfelt. Because of the length, I'll deliver in multiple installments. Here's part 1, about 1,000 words. The days that followed carried a softness Emma had never known before. It was as though the air itself had decided to be gentle, wrapping her in unseen arms whenever she walked to work, whenever she poured her tea, whenever she dared to imagine what her life might look like now that the boundary between lie and truth had blurred into something luminous. She and Ryan settled into a rhythm, not yet lovers, not quite colleagues, not merely partners in pretense. Something in between, something fragile and yet astonishingly real. Their lives began to weave together in small threads, a shared coffee before meetings, quiet check-ins during the chaos of presentations, an unspoken language of glances that carried reassurance across crowded rooms. One evening, after a particularly long day, Emma returned to her apartment and found a small package waiting at her door. The handwriting on the label was unmistakably his, elegant, precise, restrained. She opened it carefully, her heart already fluttering. Inside lay a notebook, bound in deep blue leather, its cover smooth beneath her fingertips. Tucked between the pages was a single note. For when your words need a home. Her throat tightened as she traced the letters. A gift not of extravagance, but of recognition. He had seen her scribbling thoughts into scraps of paper, napkins, post-its that littered her desk. And instead of mocking the mess, he had offered her a place to gather them. Healing, she thought again. The act was healing. The next day she left a small box on his desk before he arrived. Inside was a fountain pen, sleek, understated, crafted in silver. Attached was a note. For when precision deserves beauty. She imagined his reaction when he discovered it, the slight arch of his brow, the almost smile he tried to hide. Their exchanges became a quiet thread through their days. Not flowers or jewelry or grand gestures, but gifts of usefulness, of presence, of seeing. The kind of gifts people give when they have begun to study each other not as mysteries to be solved, but as lives to be tended. As the weeks unfolded, their story, born of panic, nurtured by lies, grew roots in soil neither of them had expected. There were dinners, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends who now believed wholeheartedly in their union. There were walks through the park, where their conversation drifted from work to books to childhood memories. And there were silences, oh, the silences, that felt like balm poured over wounds they had carried far too long. One night they sat on Emma's couch, a blanket draped loosely across them. The city hummed outside, but inside was only the soft glow of a lamp and the steady sound of their breathing. Emma leaned her head on his shoulder, tentative at first, then fully, as if surrendering a weight she had carried for years. Ryan did not move. He did not stiffen or shift. He simply let her rest, his arm curving around her as though it had always been meant to. "You know," she murmured, eyes half closed, "this started as the worst idea I've ever had." "Statistically speaking," he said, tone dry but tender, "it should have collapsed within 24 hours. "And yet," she smiled into his sweater, "here we are." "Here we are," he echoed, his voice low, steady, almost reverent. The moment stretched. wrapped in the warmth of the blanket and the softness of the night. Emma closed her eyes fully then, allowing herself the luxury of peace. For the first time in her adult life, she felt entirely safe, not because the world had changed, but because someone had chosen to stand beside her in it. It was not yet love declared, not yet vows or promises, but it was a beginning, one she treasured with all the care of someone who had once believed such things were beyond her reach. And somewhere in the quiet, she thought, perhaps the greatest healing does not come in thunderclaps or miracles. Perhaps it arrives like this, soft, steady, in the arm around your shoulders, and the whisper that tells you, steady, you are not alone anymore.